Um, uh, Paul, should I start over again? So it's all recorded? Okay. So good afternoon. Welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO. Welcome also to those online. I'm happy to host the official release of Reducing the Risks from Rapid Demographic Change. I'm trying to reduce the risks of my own rapid demographic change by eating better and getting more exercise. But we'll see in a more global and larger sense how we do this as a community. This is our second publication on global risk conducted in partnership with Zurich Insurance Group and our colleagues from the University of Denver's Pardee Center for International Futures. We do a lot of exciting partnerships, but I would say that this three-way collaboration has been one of the most fruitful. Working with one of the most knowledgeable financial insurance groups across the world, Zurich, working with the University of Denver's Pardee Center, which is absolutely cutting edge on this set of issues, and then, of course, our own Atlantic Council team, led by Matt Burrows, who was looking after strategic futures and strategic foresight at the National Intelligence Council through a great deal of his career, and now has brought those skills and capabilities to the Atlantic Council and to this work. Together, we're currently undertaking a multi-year project to gain an understanding of how the costs and benefits of future risk developments could affect global prosperity over time, and what businesses and policymakers can do to secure the best possible outcomes. Identifying and assessing global trends to inform policy and draw implications for strategy lies at the core of the Strategic Foresight Initiative's mission inside the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council, and we're very excited to be working on such relevant topics. We began our project with a look at systemic cyber risks. This grew out of a lunch we had with the leadership of Zurich, where we wondered and asked ourselves, is there a cyber subprime? Is there an aggregation of cyber risk in a certain place where it can come up and bite us in a way that we're not expecting, not prepared for? We produced two publications that explored the benefits of emerging tech and connectivity, but also cascading cyber shocks and how they will affect economic growth over time. Today, we are continuing this important work on global risks with the release of a new publication that investigates demographic trends and the major uncertainties surrounding them. Longer life expectancies, combined with increasing pension costs and healthcare spending, threaten to consume the national budgets of high-income countries in the West. Matt was just telling me that current health spending in the U.S. is now 18% of GDP. So that's money not going into other things as important as healthcare is. That can sap resources that could be invested elsewhere, from education to research and development or to infrastructure. However, these problems are not just affecting the United States or even just the West. China and other middle-income powers also have to deal with an aging workforce and unsustainable health and pension costs in the next decade. This could be a particular problem for China. While these countries still have relatively large working-age populations, they are quickly approaching the end of their demographic windows. The challenge for them will be whether or not they acknowledge the transformative trends that are unfolding and adapt them in time. For sub-Saharan African countries, the biggest risk remains overpopulation, so a different sort of demographic risks. What makes this report unique is the inclusion of futures modeling conducted by the Pardee Center for International Futures under the leadership of Dr. Barry Hughes. The Pardee Center's forecasting system served as the report's primary tool to analyze data and develop alternative future scenarios. It also allowed us to investigate future uncertainties, including what happens when people live longer, what happens with sustained migration influxes, that's of course a big topic now in Europe, but also beyond, and what happens if high fertility rates are reduced. Thanks to their modeling, we can really grasp the demographic risks and potential benefits for high, medium, and low-income countries, so it's an important tool. With us today to discuss these transformative trends and their implications are several prominent demographic, economic, security, and insurance experts. We're particularly pleased today to have Paul Horgan with us, who will provide some welcoming remarks and join us for the panel discussion. He's the head of global corporate in North America for Zurich Insurance. Paul is responsible for the direction, management, and performance of all global corporate business in the United States and Canada, so a huge job. Previously, he was Zurich's head of group reinsurance, serving at the company's worldwide headquarters in Zurich, Switzerland. His career has included roles in reinsurance, underwriting, finance, marketing, and account management. I want to thank you personally, and please also pass on our thanks to Mario Greco, your global chief executive, who's also on our international advisory boards. I want to thank you for this multi-year partnership with the Atlantic Council. Your team's knowledge of the issues and dedication to the project and your own rich resources in terms of thought leadership have helped make this work on global risk so successful. I also want to thank David Bohl from the Pardee Center, who was an integral part of the team responsible for researching and producing this publication. So thanks to you and the Pardee Center team for the extraordinary work that you've done to make this report possible. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is public and on the record, so tweet to your heart's delight, pass on everything you learn, and for the panelists, be provocative enough so people will want to quote you. For those of you on Twitter, please follow and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag AC4Cite, so hashtag AC4Cite. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the discussion, and please don't forget to grab your copy of the report in the lobby. Paul, the floor is yours.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody coming today. We're really excited at Zurich to be a part of this partnership with the Atlantic Council, and the reason that it's so important to us is it really fits into two critical parts to us. Our mission at Zurich is to help our customers understand and protect themselves from the risks associated with their lives, their businesses, and that goes from big corporations to individuals. We also look to run our business really through the Zurich Commitment, and the Zurich Commitment talks about our commitment to our customers, our employees, our shareholders, and the communities that we live and work. And for a company like Zurich, we have a global footprint. We do business in over 170 countries. So when we think about being a contributing partner to the communities that we live and work, there's an aspect that we are really part of the global community and want to make sure that we're contributing to that discussion in areas that are important to the community today. The other thing we do, so to do this, we try to partner with people like the Atlantic Council on what we think are relevant areas. We deal with the World Economic Forum and putting together their global risk report every year, again, to try to help our customers and help the leadership understand the risks that are out there and things we should be talking about to help mitigate those risks as we go forward. So, when we think about being in 170 countries and trying to again, give an active role in the dialogue for this, we look for areas where we can add some expertise, where we can look at an area and say, not only have we identified something that we should be thinking about, but where can Zurich bring its expertise to add value to that particular issue? So one of the areas that's very important to us is, as an example, would be flood insurance and flood resilience. For us, this is an area that is really becoming more and more challenging as we have climate changes occurring across the globe. And the other challenging piece of it is, for individuals, over 60% of losses that occur for floods don't happen in flood zones. So we have to put much more thought and rigor around how we view this risk. So Zurich has used its expertise in modeling, in CAT modeling, and understanding the climate change to help identify communities that may be at higher risk for flood, and then working with NGOs to help them build flood resilience programs that that help in helping them harden their communities through zoning codes and building techniques, as well as disaster preparedness and post-disaster relief, to really make sure that these communities are as resilient as possible to withstand a flood should it occur in their area. The other thing we try to do is, after a lot of major floods, we go in and do a post-event analysis and really get to try to get root causes of what caused these floods around the globe. And we've released over a half dozen of these reports in the last few years. The most recent one we just released a few weeks ago on the South Carolina floods of 2015. Again, just lessons learned, trying to add some expertise so we can help communities be more resilient in these types of areas. So really looking forward to the conversation today, because the work we've done with the Atlantic Council fits into that mold. You know, we've tried to look at risks that aren't just right in our immediate future, but really try to take a look up and say, what's coming at us and how can we prepare for them? And so we've done some work on the cyber topic, which is important. Today we've worked with them on the demographics and how that change is going to implement and influence all parts of the globe and all parts of society, and start the dialogue there, and then move into next year into geopolitical risk and how that in the future could have an impact on the world and how we need to coordinate in that environment. So very important things. Looking forward to, again, future risk and trying to help our customers understand that risk and society understand that risk better. So really looking forward to the discussion today and the panel, and thank you very much for the hard work. So thank you.
All right. So as Fred mentioned, I'm here representing the Pardee Center for International Futures. The Pardee Center, kind of core to the work that we do is using the International Futures Forecasting System. Now, we like to call it IFS for short. IFS is a long-range global integrated forecasting system. It's long-range in the sense that we are more comfortable forecasting out 5, 10, 20, 50 years, depending on the issue, than we are kind of forecasting out in business cycles. It's global in the sense that we provide our forecast for 186 different countries, and it's integrated not just across these issue areas, or not just across these countries, but across a wide range of issue areas, of which demographics is a very important element. So demographics is referred to sometime. There was a demographer named Michael Teitelbaum who refers to it as human tectonics. So like their geological counterparts, they are very slow moving, so as to be almost imperceivable sometimes in the short range, but nevertheless have very large implications for society, for economics, for politics even. So that's kind of a nice fit with our model itself, because again, we're a long-range model, and we are integrated. The way and demographics plays a enormously crucial role in all of this. So of the other human systems, demographics also allows us some very unique perspectives into the future of education, the evolution of attainment, as well as a number of health implications as well, the epidemiological transitions over time. And of course, demographics, as far as labor and consumers go, plays a massive role in economics as well. Now, there's a number of also physical structures in which this touches, including infrastructure, agriculture, energy, technology, and the environment. And we also integrate this with questions of governance, security, capacity, and inclusion, government finance, and international politics. These kind of allow us some very useful insights across all these different issue areas. And when we kind of began the study and looked back at the historical trends, combined those with our current data and forecasts, we realized, and this is probably pretty well known to any demographers out there, that the world is really entering into an area in which the global demographic structure is just being turned upside down on its head. For the majority of human existence, population has been very stable. There's been very high birth rates, but that's been met by very large rates of mortality. Now, today, just within the last 100 years, within the last 50 years, fertility rates have really plummeted across a number of more advanced economies where birth rates are now below replacement and kind of catching up across the board. So a lot of change is happening right now, right? We expect that this change will largely kind of come to a head out by 2060, when in most countries birth rates will kind of come back in line with death rates, and population will again settle, if not begin to decline again. But during this transition, a lot will happen, right? So the countries today that are currently enjoying a wide range of benefits from their demographic trends, contributions to growth, low dependency ratios, by 2035, by 2050, a lot of those countries will kind of be facing a number of demographic-related challenges. Whereas today, the countries that are struggling to keep up with their high fertility rates could actually be experiencing being like just in the middle of a demographic sweet spot. Ooh, that one didn't come out. So essentially, our goal was try to think about how do we evaluate the different demographic-related opportunities and risks that countries will experience. And one useful way of looking at that is through the demographic transition, right? So the demographic transition is a transition that all societies will go through. It begins with very high levels of fertility and mortality, and will end with very low levels of fertility and mortality, two different equilibrias, essentially. But throughout that period, countries or groups will experience different sets of risks and benefits. So the younger countries experiencing higher levels of internal conflict and a struggle to educate and pay for healthcare for a very large youth population. The more advanced economies, the much older, more mature populations, will be experiencing financial issues surrounding their pensions, again providing health care, but this time to the elderly populations. And we could even see perhaps some intergenerational issues appearing there. However, there's and actually I just saw him sitting in the audience right here. I have a quote up here on the board saying that this transition is a bad news, good news, bad news story. And this comes right from a fellow sitting here in the second row, Richard Sincata. So we talked about kind of the bookended these financial risks, but in the middle there's also quite a bit of demographic opportunity here. We have higher levels of labor participation, which are direct contributions to growth, higher savings rate, and lower dependency ratios. So to kind of operationalize these, we looked at three main financial outcomes and also some macroeconomic outcomes. The one that we began with was the education needs, right? So these younger populations, oftentimes these lower income countries, are facing challenges in educating their populations. Right now, obviously, they won't be educating the entire populations, but the need, the ability to, the challenge to educate the entire youth population at levels that higher income countries are, will remain fairly enormous over the time horizon that we're looking at. But countries that are in upper middle income status or lower middle income status will actually begin to see a bit of a reprieve of this moving forward, right? So fewer students are going through the system. That means lower costs, essentially. It frees up resources. Now, these resources can be reinvested into education or potentially move into other areas of the economy. With the healthcare story, this is kind of this. Again, it applies to both younger countries and more mature countries as well. The younger countries face the burden of these larger communicable disease burdens that largely affect youth populations, and paying for those can be fairly costly relative to their national income. But that again begins to lessen a bit as countries advance through the demographic transition. In this case, we already are beginning to see that in many low-income countries this rate is falling dramatically, but in lower middle-income countries they're perhaps at the bottom of this trough and will begin to increase again. High-income countries, though, a completely different story, right? These are the countries that have much older populations. They also face more costly diseases of affluence, non-communicable diseases like cancers and heart disease, which generally are more costly to treat. There's probably no turning back of this trend. As countries continue to age, this health cost will continue to rise also, and as Fred mentioned, this kind of might squeeze out other areas of the budget. So the retirement needs is another interesting question. This is kind of one that's felt largely by countries that are more advanced, have progressed further along the demographic transition. This has so as populations are living longer and longer, they are depleting a number of or they're depleting their own savings, which means that the government kind of will probably have to step in and cover a larger part of this. Pensions, this is a story that plays out in health care or pensions the same, but in terms of retirement needs, the pension question is a tricky one, because how is that going to be remedied, right? And largely the answer is migration, or more often pension reform. And what we see is pension reform is something that has to be considered very early on, or sooner rather than later, I guess. For example, this can cause a number of social issues as well. France in 2010 raised their retirement age from, I think it was 60 years to 62, and were met by millions of people in the streets protesting. France had the luxury of aging very slowly, though, relative to the rest of the world, or relative to, I guess, the lower income counterparts. China, for example, is aging at a much more rapid rate, meaning that they will have a smaller window to take advantage of their favorable demographic tailwinds, but also shorter time to adapt and prepare for these oncoming challenges facing more mature populations. So, the final area, I guess, that we used to evaluate some of the demographic challenges, risks, and opportunities were labor's direct contribution to growth. So, as we know, labor is one of the primary factors of production in any economy, and many economies traditionally have enjoyed quite a large portion of their economic growth that can be attributed to labor growth, essentially. This, however, is changing across the board. McKinsey last year actually released a report that stated even holding productivity growth rates at the same level, over the next 50 years we would expect GDP growth rates to decline by 40%, purely because of changing demographic patterns. So while low-income countries can expect to enjoy kind of a sustained high level through 2030, lower middle-income countries are already beginning to see a large decline in labor contribution to growth, and upper middle and high-income countries might even begin to experience some net negative contributions to growth from the changing labor patterns. So, kind of after presenting this framework for evaluating the costs and benefits of demographic risk, we turn to constructing some alternative futures, some new scenarios to explore the uncertainties around demographics. Now, the mechanisms of demographics are fairly well understood, right? If you want to know what the population next year will be, all you need to know is the number of births, the number of deaths, and if we're at the country level, not the global level, you'll need to know how many people are entering or leaving the country, right? So this kind of gives us our three main areas of uncertainty. So the first area of uncertainty is around that death component. So what happens if we live longer? In this scenario, what we did is we simulated extensions in healthcare technology, essentially. Extensions that allowed people to live longer. They were dying less. People were no longer dying as often from premature death from heart disease or from cancers, other non-communicable diseases like that. And what we found was that this has kind of disproportionate impact. The impacts that these have really depend on the age structure of the country, right? So here what we're looking at is a pan. We have France here, which has a much more older age structure, right? So the individuals that are going to benefit from these technological advances are going to be those that are already kind of beyond retirement age. So they're kind of the net consumers as opposed to the producers. So what you see with this life extension is that the healthcare, now here we're representing the healthcare shortfall. So essentially, what are the healthcare costs minus what the government is able to pay? That shortfall increases fairly dramatically, right? Whereas in the case of China, which has a younger age structure, some of these benefits are accruing to those that are still in the workforce, right? So we're reducing overall healthcare shortfalls, and however, that is liable to change, right? Because as China also passes through demographic transition and begins to age, and those cohorts now become more elderly and less productive, the impacts can kind of exacerbate the condition, particularly in the case of China, because we're about to see a large cohort pass into that kind of retirement age area. Now, of course, retirement age is kind of might be a tricky topic, particularly in the context of China, but nevertheless, there's due to the one-child and two-child policies about to pass into, we're about to see a large wave of people entering into the plus 65 category. Another scenario that we looked at was increased migration, right? So migration was another one of those uncertainties that we can look at, and a very hot topic right now. We started off this scenario by trying to simulate an increase of migrants from Syria to Germany in line with what the federal government was projecting. Now, since due to the deal that the EU has with Turkey, the influx that we've simulated is largely going to overestimate the number of migrants that enter the country, but nevertheless, it'll serve as a useful scenario. So as we can see here, this is a graph of total German population, and we see kind of two main bumps before today, and those are largely defined by influxes in migration, right? So Germany itself has a relatively low and today net negative population growth rate. So any major changes in migration are going to be seen throughout the larger population. This third hump that we've kind of simulated from this increase of migrants is kind of in line with the previous two. So now one of the major things that this can help out is, since these migrants are largely of working age and not kind of don't have the same demographic profile as the native German population does, it can help to offset some of that labor deficit. So what we can actually see here is while Germany today is seeing a net decrease in economic growth rates due to their declining labor force, an influx of migration to the magnitude that we've simulated could actually, in the short run, reverse this trend, right? Nevertheless, continual population decline will still have a net negative contribution to growth by 2035. Though the increase in migration does help to offset this. To the extent that by 2035, in this scenario, Germany experiences an increase of $140 billion to their GDP annually, which helps to offset the pension gap by about $17 billion annually, and the healthcare gap by about $25 billion annually. The final scenario that we looked at was regarding fertility rates. As we know, this is there is some room for governments here to influence fertility rates. We've seen this in China, in Iran, in Tunisia. So Sub-Saharan Africa, or equatorial Africa, has sustained very high levels of fertility rates. The average births per woman, I believe, there is somewhere around 5. That's about twice that of the rest of the world. So the scenario that we're looking here, now that sustained high fertility rates causes a lot of issues. Again, we've explored with healthcare and finance, but just extending service access in general makes it quite a bit more difficult. So in this scenario, what we did is we tried to reduce fertility rates in equatorial Africa down to levels closer to replacement rates, right? Closer to that of higher income countries. Oops, we jump ahead? Oh yeah, all right, here we go. So that in the short run, that since there's again a lot of inertia in some of these demographic systems, but also in education systems, we don't see kind of an immediate response to this necessarily. But by 2035, we do see a reduction in this primary and secondary education spending gap, right? So again, this is looking at how much it would cost to educate all of the age-appropriate youth at the levels of education that higher income countries are paying on a per student level. But nevertheless, out by kind of 2040, that trend, that gap, is no longer expanding at a fairly high rate like what we would suggest in the base case here, but instead it begins to reverse. So this is freeing up a lot of resources that these countries could then start putting towards other areas of the economy, or reinvesting it back into their youth to really allow them to kind of take advantage of their favorable demographic situation. So there's, as Fred mentioned, there's a lot of analysis that went into this. This was a very brief overview, but if you're looking, or if you're so masochistic and would like to dig into some of the nitty-gritty data and assumptions and modeling, please feel free to visit our website, party.du.edu, where you can find the larger document. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. It's been a real joy to work with the Pardee Center on this, and as you can see, it's a very complex, I think, analysis that you have to do, and long-term analysis always introduces some uncertainty, so that's why we were examining the different scenarios. We want to turn in this panel to really discuss the implications, and particularly we're going to look at implications for the insurance sector, also more generally implications on the economy, and also for security. And I have 3 excellent panelists here to help us navigate through this complex subject area. And the first you've already heard from, Paul Horgan, who's, as Fred said, head of Zurich's Global Corporate in North America. Next is Jana Reeves, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, but her day job is actually in McKinsey Global Institute, and she covers urbanization, economy, technology. And just a shout out, she's been a wonderful counselor for the Strategic Foresight Initiative, and we value her opinion on practically everything immensely. And then Kate Kidder is from the Center for New America Security, or CNAS. She works on military veterans and society programs and has expertise on military personnel, policy, defense budgeting, and defense legislation, foreign aid. So welcome to you all, and thanks for helping us clarify the implications and also get to some of the policy fixes. So I'm going to begin with you, Paul. You know, the insurance company has quite a bit of skin in the game here.
Yes.
And you're on really the right in the front line. What are the big takeaways for you and others at Zurich? How will you use the report, but also, you know, what are the policy things that you'll be thinking about?
Yep. No, that's great. I think one of the things that we think about is, you know, as I mentioned, we want our customers to understand and help manage their risk. And when we often think about risk in insurance, tend to think about products that we sell. But one of the key things that we try to do with our risk managers and the people who are really in charge of risk in corporate America is to arm them with really important things about enterprise risk. Think about the totality of risk. And this really strikes at very much strategic concerns for a business, holistic concerns that are really at the board level. And so being able to arm our insurance buyers with this type of information that they can then share with their boards and bring them at a different level to help think about risk holistically rather than by product, but more what's really going to be a big threat to our customers. And so to do that, we will definitely be sharing this, not just through our social media and everything, but through our number of meetings we have with our risk managers and our brokers, and then also through our enterprise risk programs, which we have both for Zurich as an industry to think about the risks that we're looking at, but then also we're involved in a number of industry enterprise risk programs, and we'll be taking these ideas forward and trying to get it into their thought process going forward.
Well, thanks. Jana, you know, we talked a lot here about, I think, the risks for the high-income countries. But you've done a lot of work on some of the developing, emerging market countries. What do you see as the risks there? And what, you know, when you look at this, do you think of it, you know, again, in this categorization of high, low, upper middle, lower middle, or is it a different categorization when you think about where the risk hits the most?
No, that's a great question. Indeed, I think the overall demographic perspective that you have is very consistent with what we have, of course, I think it is. And the overall risk to economic growth, I think, is very clear, and it's very uneven across the different regions. But when you start thinking about things like fiscal risk and the implications for policy, there are two factors that matter. On one hand, you have the demographic trends, and then there are actually the entitlements or the structures in the policy of how do you transfer income from those who are working and making, generating the value to either the younger children in forms of education, most importantly, but in other ways too, they need the support, or the elderly. And actually, when you look at the countries that are particularly on the middle income range, I think some of them are in situations that you don't realize how risky they are unless you look at both sides. So let me give you, first illustrate the case of South Korea, for example, that one could argue has done that very effectively. Starting from the 1960s, they were still they were very much at the early positive part of David's curve. They invested heavily into education. They started that in the 1960s. They dramatically raised education level, and no coincidence, that was the time where their economic boom happened. And I think this is an underappreciated part of the Korean story oftentimes. And now I think they still continue to subsidize their young much more than they do their elderly. So the transfers to young continue to be higher than the transfers in per capita for the elderly. But when you look at some of the emerging markets, like Brazil, for example, they still are doing okay. They are amongst the more fast aging, amongst the middle income economies, but they are not as close there as China is. But when you look at those transfers and the structure of that transfer system, they today provide 10 times more transfers to pensioners than they do to young people. And at their income level, that really is potentially the risk because, of course, the group of the elderly is going to continue to grow while the investment on the young to make them productive and generate the income in the coming years is going to be a bigger factor. So I think when you look at some of those countries that are both kind of getting to the end of the positive part of David's curve, looking at how are they investing on the younger and the workers of the future versus the pensioners will matter. And I think this is a critical question for many of the African, Indian regions where you basically are still in the wave where you could potentially make the most of your younger generations, but it is an opportunity that you can miss if you don't make those investments.
Great. Kate, we really didn't get into the security questions here, and I think, you know, particularly looking in the U.S. case, I mean, we've seen all these graphs and the rise in healthcare costs and pension costs. What does that mean for defense?
Yeah, I think there are a number of things that this report really informs. So first of all, if we look from an American perspective at the global threat environment, the 5 big threats that the Department of Defense lays out that we're facing are Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism. And I think you know, this report really does kind of target some of the areas that we're looking at for threat environments. So in low-income countries, looking at Africa and parts of the Middle East, where we face a growing counterterrorism or a terrorism threat that we're trying to counter, we see that as you know, projected out in both the short-term model and the long-term model, that it's a very youthful population, and that correlates very heavily with instability as societies wrestle with how best to include their young, particularly young men in their society in economic terms and educational terms, and that raises the level of potential instability for a threat there. I think if we look out at China and Russia, we see a different story. Those would be more peer competitors, and so what we're really looking at there is what is the nature of the potential population they could recruit their military from. So in the short-term model that you've presented, both China and Russia look very similar to the US, although over the long term it looks like Russia will be a more aged population and may actually inform strategy as to how we would counter the recruitment threat there for a peer adversary.
On the U.S., I mean, in terms of recruitment, I mean, because you basically, U.S. military is going high-tech, has gone high-tech for a long time. Industries are depending on higher level of education, skill level. So obviously, and your labor pool, as David has shown, is beginning to shrink. Particularly as your boomer generation goes into their twilight years and retires. So what does that mean, you know, for the Pentagon, and is the Pentagon thinking about this?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different aspects here. We do see longer lifespans, which is really squeezing on the healthcare and the retirement accounts. This is something that has, you know, is eating away at kind of the not just R&D accounts, but also the operational accounts. And so this is something that the Pentagon's really facing head on, but also that Congress has gotten involved in. So there are movements afoot to look at different ways to structure retirement. So we're looking at more of an enhanced thrift savings plan, which looks more like the civilian 401k system as opposed to the prior military retirement system, but trying to figure out a way that's equitable to someone who has served for a career, that they would end up with the same amount of money just through a different structure. On the healthcare side, there's really some innovation underfoot. So while the U.S. And the world economy is seeing an explosion in healthcare costs, DoD healthcare costs are exploding at a rate that exceeds the level in civilian sector. So thinking through different structures, one of the big ideas out there in the private sector is fee for outcome as opposed to fee for service, and this is a model that the Pentagon is thinking about and that Congress is thinking about imposing to get more outcomes from the limited amount of dollars that we have. And it'll be increasingly important as defense budgets decline and the overall budget feels the squeeze. Another demographic shift that we've seen over time is when the retirement and military healthcare systems were set up, when the basic infrastructure was set up in the post-World War II era, there were two things. People were really broken when they left the military service, and they didn't live nearly as long as they do now. So we see now that military retirement and healthcare is you have to project it out, 40 years after someone retires, which may be the exact cost of service, but it's something that we need to plan around.
Paul, is there some same reflections of this same kind of process and trends in the private sector at Zurich? Are you thinking about your workforce as well?
Yeah, no, it very much is, and as the report talks about, there's a place in this for the government to be involved, for business to be involved, and then the individual to be involved, and for business, when we look at this, we're looking at how can we make our employee base more effective and more efficient through using robotics and artificial intelligence, so we can get more productivity out of that. We're also looking at trying to be much more flexible and talking about being much more flexible at work, whether it's how people work so we can keep younger people engaged in the workforce and not have them kind of leave for having children or family issues, as well as people when they get to retirement age to really be more of a career thinking of not just up, 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 out, but getting up and then going kind of sideways or down or part-time, and really being able to keep that asset longer, and both to help us bring that next generation through and to kind of fill that talent gap that's coming out there. And with that comes other challenges. I mean, as you have older workers in the workforce, you've got to make sure the ergonomics are correct for them to be working through that. So we spend a lot of time with our customers making sure that the workplace is safe and appropriate for the abilities of the people who are in those workspaces today. And it's even taking insurance as an example. McKinsey actually did a study that said by 2018, up to 25% of our industry will be eligible for retirement. So it's amazing to be in an industry for 30 years and still be young. It's very positive. But for us, we've had to really adapt to that, and it's something that does take time. So at Zurich, we've got two programs. One is our risk engineers are some of our most senior people. And we've had to try to recruit. So we've had a very aggressive recruiting over the last 3 years, recruiting over 40 new risk engineers. But we also need the older risk engineers to both mentor the younger ones, transfer that knowledge, and then have them stick around long enough to leverage through. So we've had to be much more flexible with part-time and contract work with them so that their lifestyle fits and they still can be engaged with us. So another area that's been very challenging is with the changing demographics, it's not just age, it's also the makeup and complexion of the workforce. And the workforce today is a very different looking workforce than, say, the traditional insurance industry workforce of 30 years ago. And so us to attract today's talent into our industry and have them come to careers there is a real challenge. And so we've actually started an apprenticeship program with a community college in Chicago where we're taking high school students, bringing them into training programs to understand either underwriting or claims and insurance, have an internship with Zurich, and come out and have a job with Zurich. And these are people that normally wouldn't be in our industry. We're trying to attract and really give them a path to solid middle-income jobs in the U.S., which are harder and harder to come by these days. And we think this is a great path, and we're hoping it becomes a success, and other financial institutions will kind of jump on, and we can really make this a working solution. And we took this model from Switzerland, where they actually have a very advanced apprenticeship program in that society, and we've taken that and tried to see if we can adopt it here.
Great. Jana, on the technology question and productivity, because I guess this is something, and it goes beyond the demography we're all getting a little stumped on. I mean, we've seen productivity basically flatlined in the U.S. and Western countries for a long time. We know, as David was talking about, that with the labor pool beginning to diminish, we actually need that productivity even more if we want to continue to grow the pie. Is technology the savior here? But we also hear politically that it seems to be the enemy for some people who can't find jobs anymore, at least the low-skilled jobs.
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me start by framing why, I would say, to answer your question first, technology alone is not the solution, but productivity more broadly explained. And let me explain why. Because as David mentioned, when you look in our work, previous work, when we looked at the last 50 years, the global economy, the global GDP expanded by 3.6% a year roughly. Half of that growth, 1.7% a year of global GDP growth, came from the fact that we had more employees globally. So we get a lift simply because we had more people working. The second half came from the fact that each person became more productive. When we look at the next 50 years, the first engine of that global growth almost collapses. Instead of 1.7% a year, we'll get 0.3. So that means that global GDP growth is really going to depend on productivity. And the question is, we have grown globally about 1.8% a year. The US has grown a little bit slower than that, about 1.5% or so, and over the long period. The question is, will the productivity be able to not just keep up its speed, but also potentially make up for some of that demographic decline? And that really is one of the reasons why productivity is something that I'm sure you are hearing more about it on the debates. It is one of the hottest topics amongst economists right now. We really don't understand what is going on with productivity because it has actually plummeted much below the long-term average right now, and it worries everyone. So the question of technology is one where that often anchors. People talk about, are you a technology optimist or are you a technology pessimist? Where is the technology going to go? Obviously, track record is that technology has been solid for a long time. There's no way nobody can have the facts of where that is, so I think people just need to take their stance. We have a very strong evidence when we look at around us. We have never seen a technology pipeline that is broader and deeper. It's coming from all directions. The potential is definitely there for technology to continue to drive. The question, perhaps because of the demographic environment, is, are companies going to make those investments to take advantage of that? Because we'll see slower metabolic rate in the economy as we have some fewer and fewer new people coming in every year. I think that's one question. And then there is just the question that economists talk about, which is the uncertainty, the fact that people are pessimistic, the invisible hand or the animal spirits of the investors. I think right now there's a big uncertainty of how much of those investments are made. However, we actually don't think that technology is all the story on the productivity one. When we looked at the potential for growth, in our case, we looked at across our industries globally, we saw a lot of opportunities for people to just adopt today's technologies, today's best practices that could get us, frankly, more than make up for the population growth decline in the future. A lot of that has to do with simply making sure that every hour that we spend on the workforce is as productive as it could be. So even if the technology slows down, that doesn't mean we can't accelerate productivity. And let me give you just one example. I think we can think of it. So for example, of the productivity growth potential in the US, half of that is catch-up, half of that is technology frontier. In emerging markets, 80% of the potential is catch-up, 20% is the frontier. But let me give you one example of the kinds of things we can do, even in a sector like healthcare, that is clearly one of the key areas for the fiscal balance. The world's most productive and largest single eye operation operator is Aravind Eye Care in India. What they have done is that they have established a process where they are able to provide low-cost eye care to Indians of all income levels. And they have done that largely by building a process that is very efficient, very homogenized across the different steps. So for example, in their operating room, 70% of the work is done by paramedics. You don't need to have a surgeon with 15 years of education. You can have someone who is actually really good at that step, what they do. And that means that they alone do 2/3 of as many of eye operations as the UK health system, and they do that at 1/6 of the cost and with fewer infections. And I think that's just one of those examples. We don't need to get 3D printing across the board. We don't need to have a lot of these new things implemented. Simply doing what we already do better and learning from what everybody else has done, I think, can get us a long way there.
Okay, one further question, then we'll turn it to the audience. I want you to, Jana, to talk a little bit about cities, because it's another, obviously, a lot of cities are the ones that draw in the youth. I mean, so I would imagine, and I think some of your studies have talked about higher growth rates or potential in cities. But there are other cities that we know, I come from the Midwest, there are a lot of cities there that are actually decaying.
That's a great question. That's very close to my heart. Cities have been the engines of global growth for a long time, but they are actually facing a double demographic whammy, if you want. Not only is population growth slowing down, but in many parts of the world, urbanization, meaning people moving from rural areas to cities, is also kind of plateauing because most people already live in cities. And that means that they will really face a very different environment than they did in the last 50 years across the globe. And I'll give you just a few examples of what already today, that's going to mean that there's going to be very many different kinds of cities facing very many different kinds of demographic challenges, and it's very uneven, not just across countries, but across cities. So for example, in the US, the share of 0 to 14-year-old of children in Provo, Utah, the share of 65-plus-year-olds in Provo, Utah is less than 30%. In Punta Gorda, Florida, it's over 50%. So you have older cities, you have younger cities. In Italy, Naples has 1/6 of the population is under 15. In Trieste, it's 1/10. And even in China, the average age in Shenzhen is 32, and in Fushan, it's 46. So you see already cities at very different stages of that population transition. And that is only going to get wider because of the fact that if you have a high share of people on the fertility age, they are going to have more young people, while when most people are older, you have fewer young folks. And I think that creates very different risks. I think one of them you were already talking about is the recruitment. It's not just that overall you can't find them, but there's going to be some cities where it's going to be extremely hard to find young people looking for jobs. So that's one area. The other one is that we are going to have a lot more cities that see their populations decline. Across the developed world, 1 out of 6 cities is probably going to see their populations decline, and more than 9 out of 10 is actually going to have fewer 15 to 30-year-olds than they had in 15 years than they have today. So all of these changes, I think, do matter quite a bit. But I'm an optimist by inclination, so I don't want to think that everything is lost. There is one thing that actually really is a potential for cities if they can tap into it. Baby boomers is the most educated generation that's now retiring, and they will have a lot of free time on their hands. That free time of this talent, how are they going to use it? Some of them are going to work longer, some of them are going to work part-time, but many of them want to give back to their communities. They want to spend their time in a way that they actually will be productive contributors to their community. And I think there is many ways that they can give back to their cities, for example. And just one example, one of the most sustainable places on earth is a small town in Japan where most folks are retirement age. Yet they recycle everything. It is the least emissions, highest recycling rate in the world. So you can even find environmentally more productive ways of using the time because people are just less busy.
And Zurich, do you have the figures for the medium age in Zurich, Switzerland?
No, that one, no.
You may want to look into it.
Yeah.
Questions. If you would just state your name and brief question, and if you want one particular panelist to answer it, tell me. Rich?
I want to continue on Matt's question about actually recruitment.
So Rich Sincata,
Stimson Center.
Stimson Center.
And yeah, I'm sorry. Rich Sincata, that's Stimson Center. I made that ridiculous quote up there.
It's a good one.
It seemed funny at the time, actually. But Matt asked you about recruitment to the U.S. military, and you went over to retirement, which is probably a bigger issue. But still, when you go over to the Pentagon, you do hear a lot of things rattle around about, first of all, the need for very well-trained people, and secondly, the reduction in actually eligible recruits, because I don't know if this figure is correct, but the one that I've heard is that over 50% of U.S. It may be males, but I don't know if they broke it down like that. But maybe it was males that were less than 50% were really eligible after the physical and mental screening, and when you looked at their criminal record.
Yeah, so that's right, and that is a point I wanted to get to. So there's two of the trends that I've been studying, and now there's the third trend of kind of the declining population. So one is the decreasing eligibility for service, and the U.S. Army Recruiting Command will actually say it's 17% are qualified of American youth between 16 and 21. So very low rate of eligibility, and again, that is tied to different metrics, whether it's physical fitness, lack of a criminal record, education level, so required high school diploma, and a number of other factors, the ASVAB, the test that we use to test eligibility for the armed services. There's also a huge decrease in propensity towards military service. So you can have a double whammy of, well, if only a small portion of your youth are eligible and very few of them are willing to join the military, then you are really facing a very small pool. And then if you add on top of that, that if the percentage holds constant and we have a smaller population that we're pulling from, there is a crisis there. I think there have been a number of ways that the U.S. military has gone about trying to address that without lowering standards and with lowering standards. So one of the things that we saw during the height of the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan is that we did lower some of the standards, and the number of waivers that were given out, for example, for past criminal behavior, minor criminal behavior, that number increased significantly, and then there were issues on the back end. We made our numbers, but we didn't necessarily make them the way that we wanted to, and there were follow-on effects. And what that tells us is that our current all-volunteer force, while it does a fantastic job of what it needs to at the current rate, that it's very difficult to expand it rapidly in a time that we would need to. And this also interacts with the fact that we've used our National Guard and our reserve at high rates as an operational force as opposed to a strategic force over the last 15 years. So there isn't really that safety net anymore. We really do have to figure out new ways. Some of the more encouraging things that we're starting to see, though, are trying to drive up propensity, so making the case that this is a fantastic mission, that if you're someone who's really competitive and could go to Stanford or enlist in the Army, well, this is the case for why maybe you'd want to enlist in the Army or commission later on. And be thinking through who our eligible pool of candidates is. So looking to the expansion of roles to women in combat units may free up more potential candidates for different positions in a way that can maintain standards, particularly on the moral and discipline side of things.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. I'm Dave Rubinowitz. I'm retired. And Yogi Berra famously said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I'd imagine it is really tough. If 50 years ago, if somebody had suggested giving telephones to all the people in the third world, the answer would have been there's not enough copper to wire all their homes. Today, people in the third world have telephones and they don't need the copper. When the U.S. first got started, more than 90% of the population was involved in producing food. Today, it's less than 3%, and we've got more food than ever per person. Technology changes, and it really blows all these predictions way out of the range. Technological developments in healthcare and education are really massively and rapidly arriving. And how is this factored into any of these predictions? Or is it?
Jana, did you want to?
Well, I think it is true that demographics is perhaps one of those long-term trends that it's not as easy to change with technology. Clearly, we see some of the transitions, but I think that's one of those things. We have seen, for example, the average age, and which is one of the scenarios that you analyze, but average age has been increasing. A lot of that increase came because we were able to reduce infant death rates, and that adds a lot of years to everybody's life. But when you do that when at the end of current lifespan, it's much harder to add so much more, because if you don't die of one thing, you'll die of something else relatively soon. So I think it takes longer, given that we have already caught up with some of the demographic big levers, if you want, to make dramatic changes. And I know that's something that we need to consider, but demographics is the one area where I think it's harder to see dramatically different scenarios beyond the ones that you have already looked at. I think that doesn't mean that the world won't look very different, which is why we don't predict technology for beyond 10 years. I think that's one of the exciting things of the story.
But people do predict healthcare costs 50 years from now.
I think actually few people want to predict 50 years of healthcare costs because that's too scary. So.
I mean, you know, to get to this issue, you know, the Yogi Berra quote is often used to stop people planning about the future because it's seen as so unpredictable. And yet, I think the argument here is that when you have one thing, the aging, the life expectancy, increasingly you have a higher and higher proportion people also in those senior years, but you also have to be, you know, as one of the panelists said, planning for 40 years after you retire. So there's more and more need, despite the fact that we can't predict exactly what's going to happen, to get actually involved in these studies about thinking about what the future could be. And that's why we always have scenarios involved, because you can't actually, as everybody knows, predict exactly the future. But we do have to think about planning. And you know, in the report, one of the issues that we underlined is that these middle income countries actually have an advantage as they can look to the high income countries, and particularly at our pay-as-you-go pension systems, and figure out that this may not be the way to go. And you know, that's why we do these studies, not because we think we can predict the future, but that we have to think about these trends in order to prepare for what could happen. Yes, please.
Hi, Arbor Johnson with Itochu International. So this is a very practical, non-academic question, but two of you are from the private sector. So if you had to offer succinct advice based on this demographic study to your private sector clients about the 4 BRIC countries, what would that be? What does this mean for market growth in those 4 countries?
Well, I think as what they talked about with the BRIC countries, I mean, they've got challenges coming up, but I think a couple of them, they talked about Brazil being, you know, kind of in that middle segment of they've got time to bend the curve or change it. We still, as a company, you know, still see those economies as ones that over the long term still have very much high potential for you know, economic growth, and for us to be able to grow there has been generally how we've looked at them and still look at them.
So you wouldn't differentiate, I mean, Brazil versus India, very different.
Probably, that I probably wouldn't be able to tell you personally.
Well, from our perspective, we look at those countries very clearly, and I think the demographic stories are very different. So, for example, if you look at the urbanization story across the 3 regions, they are at the very different stages of both the demographics and moving to the cities that are more productive. Brazil is already there. In a way, they are largely urban. Their challenges are very different than they are for China, for example, that's still in the middle of that big transition. That they are right in the middle of people moving from rural areas to the cities. They're getting the big bang for the buck. India, on the other hand, is further behind. It is the one where we are actually waiting to see how the cities evolve. If they see their cities find a successful model for growth, we would really expect to see both the demographic boom as well as the urbanization. It really has the potential to really make the most out of that. And Russia, of course, is very close to the aging spectrum already, further ahead than Brazil, and I think that it is also much more urban already. So Russia is, I think, its time link to the demographic shift to the more challenging structure is much closer. So I think that's one way to frame those different ones when you think about the different horizons of growth. But in addition to that, I think if you asked about how would we advise our private sector clients to think about that, I think there is, and I think you have already brought up some of the key issues. You need to think about it from your customer perspective, not only which are the cities that are going to attract the talent of the future. So I mentioned Shenzhen. It's the youngest average age city in China. And it's no coincidence. It has attracted a lot of the young talent to work in the manufacturing job and the high-tech jobs. And while you have some cities that are aging relatively rapidly because they are losing a lot of the young folks. So thinking about the geographic imbalance, and if you are going to a new market, for example, which have the demographics that suit you best, not just the income, but the demographics, or perhaps which are the cities that all the young folks look for their inspiration. I mean, so for example, just to give one example, K-pop and Seoul's capacity to inspire generations of young people, not just across Asian cities, but here also. It's something that, I think if that's something that influences your business or that's your market group, you might want to look at that. So there's a market size, not just at the national level, but at the city level. And then there is, of course, your own labor force story, which is, it will be challenging to recruit in many of these regions. And particularly when they start growing, you have education is increasing, and not just the education level, but the experience and the competition for that talent, it's tougher. And it's going to be also spatial. So I think it is a very important context, and I think the way you said, Paul, it is a board level question. It is a very high level framing that influences almost all parts of the business.
I think, Steve, did you have?
First, thank you very much, the panelists. Great discussion. My name is Steve Gale. I'm with the U.S. Agency for International Development. And our focus is on low-income countries. This is sort of a practical, tactical question. You know, in low-income countries where there's a high percent of youth, there's a predominance on maximizing growth. So how do we get policy makers and decision makers to think a little bit about what's coming 5 and 10 or 15 years ahead, to think about the youth population, but also to think about the retired population? What advice could you give us about moving decision making in the kind of the right direction? Thank you.
Kate or Paul?
No, I mean, I think you know, I think when we've looked at that from a business perspective, and trying to think about how do we support those businesses from an insurance perspective, we've tried to see what products can we offer them that makes sense in that market and allows that economy to grow. So we've done a lot with trying to see how we can get, you know, small farmers or small who own just 1 or 2 cows or own small plots of land. How can we get that type of community insurance in there that allows them to have that safety net so they can start building that economy and building it forward? And it's very challenging because there's not a lot of maps out there to price it. There's not a lot of sales agents out there to sell it. So you really have to kind of, you know, go in with local NGOs and others who know that market and really try to create that environment that helps them build that system out.
Jana, did you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And for the record, I'm an economist. I'm not a political scientist, and I don't live in this town. So I think that is, I recognize the challenges that the decision makers make. So they are under very many more constraints than we wishing what they would want to do. I think, so what the policy we take at the McKinsey Global Institute, that we try to provide the facts in as clear form as we can so that they are very aware of the trade-offs. So for example, the facts on the transfers to the young and their likely return versus the transfers to the elderly. So having a very solid fact base, and then providing examples of how other people have dealt with similar problems. So I think those are the 2 tools that we think are helpful. We don't know, and we shouldn't really be the ones suggesting what they do with them because they face very different political pressures and political priorities. But I think good fact base and making that transparent and examples of what you could do if you wanted to do are the 2 things. And I think you are in a great position to provide both. Yeah.
Any last words from the panelists? Okay, I think we'll wrap up. It's been a great discussion, and thank you to the audience as well as to the panelists.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yes, it was nice meeting both of you.